Over Germany in 1943, a formation of American bombers stitched the air with a solid wall of 50 caliber fire. A Luftwaffe pilot dived in, then hesitated as the sky turned into crossing streams of tracers. The math he trusted was breaking. One gun, standardized across wings and vehicles, was rewriting the odds. August 17th, 1943, 29,000 feet above Bavaria. The air temperature sits at 40 below zero, cold enough to freeze hydraulic fluid, cold enough to make metal brittle, cold enough to turn human sweat into ice inside an oxygen mask. Captain Robert Morgan sits in the pilot's seat of a B-17 Flying Fortress. His aircraft is one of 376 bombers threading their way through German airspace toward the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. In the waist section of Morgan's aircraft, Staff Sergeant Michael Rostovich crouches behind his 50 caliber Browning M2. The gun weighs 84 pounds. With its mount and ammunition, the system tips past 200 pounds. Rostovich has fired thousands of rounds through guns like this in training. He knows the sound of it, the feel of it, the way the whole aircraft shudders when all 13 guns open up at once. What he doesn't know is that in German tactical planning rooms 500 miles east, intelligence officers are rewriting their probability models. The reports coming back from Luftwaffe fighter wings aren't making sense. According to pre-war calculations, a FW-190 fighter making a frontal attack on a B-17 should successfully press home its attack roughly 60% of the time. The models accounted for defensive fire, pilot skill, and closing geometry. But the real numbers don't match. Actual success rates have collapsed below 30%, in some engagements below 20%. The math says this shouldn't be happening. One variable has changed. Not the fighters, not the tactics, not the skill of the pilots, just one weapon system, deployed in sufficient density, reliable enough to fire continuously, networked so tightly that individual aircraft have ceased to be targets and become nodes in a defensive grid that no pre-war analyst predicted. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon so common that American planners ordered it by the hundreds of thousands, so reliable that it could fire in temperatures and conditions that jammed more sophisticated weapons. So effective that it bent the mathematics of aerial combat until German planners had to start from scratch. This is the story of how one gun forced an entire military doctrine to collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. The M2 Browning didn't start as a war-winning system, it started as a problem. How do you kill an airplane? In 1918, when John Moses Browning began designing heavy machine guns for the US military, aircraft were wood and fabric. By the 1930s, they were aluminum and steel. The .30-06 rifle cartridge could perforate a fighter's skin, but lacked the energy to cause catastrophic structural damage. Browning's solution was elemental. Make everything bigger. Bigger bullet, bigger case, bigger gun. The 50 BMG cartridge launched a 700-grain projectile at approximately 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy at the muzzle topped 13,000 foot-pounds, roughly 3 times that of a .30-06. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was a different class of weapon. The early versions were water-cooled. The M1921 could sustain fire indefinitely if supplied with water and ammunition, but it weighed over 100 pounds and required a crew to maintain. By 1933, Browning and his team at Colt had refined the design into the M2. Air-cooled, reliable, simple enough that a crew of 2 could maintain and operate it in combat conditions. The M2HB, the heavy barrel variant, pushed sustained fire capability even further. A heavier barrel profile could absorb heat for longer periods. Final system weight settled around 84 pounds for the receiver, about 128 pounds with the M3 tripod. Heavy but manageable. complex but not exotic. The ammunition itself was the other half of the equation. The US military standardized on several variants of the 50 BMG round, each optimized for different targets: M2 ball for general use, M1 tracer for observation and psychological effect, M8 armor-piercing incendiary with a hardened steel core and an incendiary mixture that ignited on impact, M20 armor-piercing incendiary tracer combining penetration, ignition, and visibility. This wasn't accidental. American doctrine emphasized standardization and logistics. One gun, one caliber, multiple loadouts, infinite applications. While Germany pursued specialized weapons, the United States weaponized simplicity. The quick change barrel system meant a trained crew could swap a hot barrel for a cold one in under 60 seconds. No tools required. The headspace adjustment required attention but became second nature to experienced crews. Operating temperature range ran from 40 below zero to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. In testing, the M2 fired reliably in desert sand, Arctic ice, and tropical humidity. Not perfectly, no weapon is perfect, but consistently enough that maintenance crews could predict failure intervals and plan accordingly. This reliability would matter more than anyone initially realized. In the air war over Europe, missions ran 8 to 10 hours. Temperatures plunged to levels that froze human tissue in minutes. Weapons that jammed were weapons that killed their own crews. The M2 kept firing, and that reliability created a psychological edge. German pilots knew American guns would answer every time. The odds began to tilt. The failure began with reasonable assumptions. German tactical planning in the late 1930s and early 1940s was among the most sophisticated in the world. Luftwaffe analysts understood geometry, probability, closure rates, deflection angles. They knew that a fighter attacking a bomber had to close within 400 to 600 meters to guarantee effective fire from 20 millimeters or 30 cannon. They knew that closing from greater distances wasted ammunition. It gave the bomber more time to take evasive action. They calculated that a typical bomber might have 3 to 5 defensive machine guns that could engage a fighter on any given approach vector. They factored in gunner training, weapon reliability, the difficulty of hitting a target moving at a relative velocity of 600 miles per hour. Their math said that frontal attacks were viable. Dangerous, but viable. The defensive guns couldn't all engage simultaneously on a frontal approach. The closure rate was too high for accurate fire. The fighter pilot could fire his entire ammunition load in one pass and then break away. The probability models supported this. The training manuals recommended it. The problem was scale and reliability and geometry. A typical B-17G carried 13.50 caliber M2 Brownings, 2 in the chin turret, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail, 1 in the radio room, 2 in the cheek positions flanking the nose. Each gun had a cyclic rate commonly between 450 and 575 rounds per minute. Each gun could engage targets at effective ranges approaching 1,800 meters. Practical combat range was usually closer to 1,000 meters. But here's what the German models missed. The bombers didn't fly alone. They flew in combat boxes. Staggered formations, typically of 18 to 21 aircraft, positioned so that the defensive fire from one aircraft overlapped with defensive fire from its neighbors. In a typical combat box, an attacker faced dozens of converging 50s, turning the approach into a probability gauntlet. It was facing 50 guns, 70 guns, 100 guns, all firing 50 caliber rounds, all creating a cone of fire that turned the airspace ahead of the formation into a probability death zone. The math looks like this. A single B-17 with 13 guns, each firing at around 500 rounds per minute, generates roughly 500 rounds per minute of defensive fire. But only the guns that can bear on a target actually matter. On a frontal attack, perhaps 4 to 6 guns can engage simultaneously. That puts around 2,500 rounds per minute entering the engagement space. That sounds manageable. But a typical combat box of 20 bombers with overlapping fields of fire can put on the order of 25,000 rounds per minute into the approach corridor. The fighter has to fly through this for 10 to 15 seconds to close from maximum range to effective cannon range. In those 15 seconds, thousands of rounds of 50 feet caliber ammunition are filling the space the fighter needs to occupy. The pilot can jink, dive, roll, but he's flying at 350 miles per hour and the bullets are flying at over 2,000. There's no dodging, there's only probability, and the geometry of overlapping fire turned probability into near certainty. German fighter doctrine, built on individual engagement models, collapsed against networked defense. The odds had shifted. German intelligence assumed that American machine guns would jam at rates comparable to their own weapons. The MG-131 and MG-151 were excellent weapons, but they experienced stoppages in extreme cold rates commonly reported around 2 to 5% per 100-round burst. Manageable, but cumulative. A gunner might clear one stoppage and then face another minutes later. The M2 Browning jammed less, not because it was better engineered in some exotic way, but because it was simpler, fewer parts, coarser tolerances, less finicky. When it did jam, the quick change barrel and straightforward disassembly meant that crews could clear stoppages in seconds. In the sub-zero temperatures at 25,000 feet, where metal contracted and lubricants thickened, the M2 kept firing while more sophisticated weapons seized. That consistency became demoralizing. Every mission, the guns worked. Every approach, the fire came. German pilots learned to expect it, to fear the inevitability of it. The odds kept tilting. The German models assumed that defensive fire would degrade over time, guns overheating, ammunition running low, gunners fatiguing. This was correct for sustained combat over 30 or 40 minutes. But strategic bombing missions weren't 30 minutes. They were 8 hours. The bombers crossed into German airspace with full ammunition loads and fresh gunners. By the time the fighters found them, the guns were cold and the crews were alert. The overlapping fields of fire meant that even if one gun overheated or jammed, 3 others were covering its sector. The Luftwaffe had optimized for engaging individual bombers. They were facing a network, on October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday, the cost became undeniable. The second Schweinfurt raid saw 60 B-17s shot down out of 291 penetrating German airspace. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. A loss rate approaching 20%. Catastrophic. But German fighter losses spiked to their highest levels of the war to that point. Luftwaffe pilots reported something new. Not fear. Combat pilots don't use that word. But a calculated reassessment. The stream of tracers created a visible web of fire. Every 5th round in a typical 50 cal belt was an M1 tracer. Pilots could see the bullets coming. They knew that for every visible tracer, 4 more invisible rounds were threading the same space. Frontal attacks became psychological as well as mathematical gauntlets. Black Thursday forced doctrinal changes, tighter escort discipline, more cautious fighter approaches. The arithmetic was rewriting itself in blood. Then, the P-47 Thunderbolt entered the equation. 8 50 caliber M2 Brownings, Mounted 4 per wing, standard loadout was around 425 rounds per gun. Total ammunition commonly exceeded 3,400 rounds. The guns were typically harmonized to converge at 300 yards, creating a kill zone roughly 10 feet in diameter, where all 8 streams of fire intersected. At convergence, the P-47 was putting out around 4,000 rounds per minute into a space the size of a large table. A 2-second burst delivered over 130 rounds. 8 50 caliber rounds hitting a FW-190 was usually sufficient to cause catastrophic damage. 16 was overkill. The P-47 could deliver both in under a second of firing time. The tactical effect was immediate. Luftwaffe fighters couldn't press attacks on bomber formations without running a gauntlet of .50 caliber fire from both the bombers and the escorts. The escorts, faster and more maneuverable than the bombers, could chase German fighters into and through the bomber formations, creating interlocking zones of fire that left no safe approach vector. German pilots adapted, attacking from below, from above, using clouds for concealment, trying to separate individual bombers from the formation, but every adaptation had a counter. Belly turrets covered the underside. Top turrets covered above. Escorts stalked the clouds. The formations tightened. By late 1944, long-range escorts and disciplined geometry let that 50 caliber wall bite earlier and farther from the bombers. German tactical doctrine had shifted completely. Frontal attacks were no longer recommended except under specific circumstances, when escorts were absent, when bomber formations had been disrupted, when ammunition loads were full and the pilot was experienced. The preferred attack became the high side pass, diving from above and behind, firing a burst, using the dive speed to exit the engagement before defensive guns could track. This was safer for the pilot, but it reduced the time on target and made deflection shooting more difficult. Hit rates declined. The bombers kept coming. The sound of it became distinctive. Survivors described it differently depending on which side they were on. Allied aircrew heard it as a hammering roar, the rattling cacophony of 10 or 12 guns firing simultaneously inside an aluminum fuselage. German pilots heard it as a ripping sound, deep and resonant, different from the lighter crack of 7.92 mm or even 13 mm fire. The 50 BMG round was heavy enough that its passage through air created a pressure wave pilots could feel in their cockpits. As one pilot later described it, the air felt like it was tearing itself apart. Whether the account is precise or impressionistic, it captures the psychological dimension. This wasn't harassing fire, this was industrial violence, delivered at a volume that overwhelmed human perception. What worked in the air bled into the roads and hedgerows. Large American armored and mechanized units didn't just mount .50 caliber guns on vehicles, they mounted them on everything. Half-tracks, jeeps, trucks, tank turrets, tank commanders, cupolas. Anywhere a man could stand, American engineers found a way to mount an M2. The philosophy was simple: maximize firepower per vehicle, maximize vehicles per unit. The result was a mobile firepower density that German forces had not planned for. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage featured 4 M2 Brownings on a powered turret mount on a half-track chassis, designed for anti-aircraft work. Cyclic rate for all 4 guns combined approached 800 rounds per minute. In late 1944, as Allied air superiority reduced the need for mobile anti-aircraft assets, the M16 transitioned to a ground support role. Against infantry, fortifications, light vehicles, and even light armor, the Quad 150 mount was devastating. Each gun could sustain fire independently. allowing the crew to walk fire across a target area. Or all four could fire simultaneously to saturate a point target. German troops gave it a nickname that reflected its effects. American crews called it the Max and Mount, after the company that manufactured the turret. Both names were accurate. Production numbers tell the strategic story. During World War II, the United States manufactured approximately 2 million 50 caliber weapons of all types. Of those, roughly 350,000 were M2HB variants. This wasn't boutique production, this was industrial scale deployment. The M2 was never intended to be rare, it was intended to be common. Every convoy had them, every defensive position had them, every tank, every command vehicle, every artillery emplacement. Scale became doctrine. The sheer ubiquity made resistance futile in ways German planners hadn't modeled. The odds had shifted completely. That consistency only held because the rear echelons never blinked. The M2's dominance rested on more than firepower. It rested on a logistics foundation that kept the guns running. American doctrine built around standardized maintenance. Every armorer trained on the same weapon. Every supply depot stocked the same parts. Barrels, bolts, extractors, springs. The parts interchangeability meant a broken gun could be repaired in minutes, not hours. Field maintenance was simple enough that crew-level fixes kept guns operational between depot overhauls. Ammunition arrived in predictable volumes. Convoys brought 50 caliber rounds forward daily. The supply chain never broke. Ammunition expenditure rates reflected this abundance. A typical American mechanized convoy in France or Germany might fire tens of thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in a day of moderate contact, not in a single engagement, across multiple brief firefights, ambush responses, reconnaissance by fire sweeps, suppressive barrages. The guns were used liberally because ammunition was plentiful. This was the inverse of German doctrine, which emphasized precision and conservation due to resource constraints. American gunners could afford to be prodigious. They suppressed anything suspicious. They fired at muzzle flashes, at tree lines, at buildings that might contain observers. The 50 caliber became the language of American firepower, the default response to almost any tactical problem. That logistical confidence translated into tactical aggression, and aggression sustained wins. Convoy tactics evolved around the weapon. Standard procedure was to mount M2s on alternating vehicles, left side mounts on odd-numbered vehicles, right side mounts on even-numbered vehicles. This ensured 360-degree coverage and prevented gaps in overlapping fields of fire. When a convoy moved through contested terrain, the 50 gunners weren't waiting for targets to appear. They were already firing, sweeping likely ambush positions, forcing any enemy to stay concealed or die. The technique wasn't subtle, it was effective. German after-action reports commonly noted that American convoys were difficult to ambush. That defensive fire often began before ambush was sprung. The M2's long effective range meant that gunners could engage threats before those threats could effectively return fire. Panzerfaust teams with a maximum effective range around 60 meters never got close enough to matter. Normandy, June 1944. The bocage country, dense hedgerows, narrow lanes, limited visibility, defensive terrain, every field a potential kill zone, every hedgerow a fortified position. The Wehrmacht had spent years preparing these positions. They understood the geometry. They knew American armor was vulnerable in close terrain. They were correct, but they hadn't accounted for the 50 caliber as a primary weapon. American tanks in the bocage didn't wait to spot targets before firing. They fired continuously. The 50 caliber on the turret roof swept hedgerows as the tank advanced. The technique was called reconnaissance by fire. If you shoot at everything, anything that shoots back reveals itself. The M2 couldn't penetrate the thick Norman hedgerows directly, but it could shred foliage, splinter branches, create suppression effects that forced defenders to stay down. German troops learned quickly that standing up to engage a tank meant immediate exposure to 50 caliber fire. The MG-42 was deadlier than the M2 in direct comparison, but it didn't matter. The MG-42 gunner couldn't acquire his target before the M2 gunner forced him into cover. Lorraine, autumn 1944. The approach to Metz, urban combat. Stone buildings, reinforced cellars, interlocking fields of fire from prepared positions. German doctrine emphasized strong point defense. A few men with machine guns and anti-tank weapons could hold a building for days if properly supplied. American doctrine emphasized firepower overmatch. The M2 Browning could punch through brick walls at ranges commonly exceeding 400 meters, not every wall, not every time, but consistently enough that German defenders couldn't rely on masonry for protection. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary round proved effective against layered brick and stone. Crews would fire bursts of 20 to 30 rounds at suspected firing positions. Watch for impact effects. Adjust. If a position stopped returning fire, they moved on. If it kept firing, they called in artillery or armor. The 50 became the reconnaissance tool, the suppression tool, often the killing tool. The Ardennes, December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive caught American forces dispersed and surprised, but even in retreat, American units retained firepower advantages. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was encircled and outnumbered. They held. Part of that story is courage and determination. Part of it is logistics. They were resupplied by air. And part of it is the M16 multiple gun motor carriage. The quad .50 mounts positioned around Bastogne's perimeter delivered suppressive fire that broke up German infantry assaults before they could form. At night, with one tracer round for roughly every 4 ball rounds, the streams of red fire created visible walls that German troops had to advance through. Psychological warfare and kinetic warfare merged. The sound alone was a weapon. 4 M2 Brownings firing simultaneously. Veterans described it as a physical presence, a pressure in the chest, a sound so loud that it disrupted thought. Reliability does more than fire. It speaks, and the enemy hears it. Night operations amplified the psychological effect. The tracer ratio meant that roughly 20% of the outgoing fire was visible. To an observer, it looked like a solid stream of light. To the gunner, it provided feedback for adjusting fire. To the enemy, it revealed the scale of fire being directed at them. Lawless, a German soldier caught in the open under 50 caliber fire at night, could see every 5th round coming, could watch the tracers arc toward him, knew that 4 times as many invisible rounds were following the same path. There's no cover from that knowledge. You go to ground and you stay there. The psychological weight of that certainty, that inevitability, broke units before bullets did. Morale crumbled under predictable, unrelenting fire. The odds had become insurmountable. Urban warfare brought its own adaptations. The 50 caliber became the primary tool for neutralizing snipers and Panzerfaust teams and buildings. Standard procedure was simple. Identify the building, put 50 rounds through every window and aperture. Pause to observe, repeat if necessary. The M2 couldn't guarantee kills against targets in deep cover, but it could create enough fragmentation, spalling, and overpressure that defenders either retreated to basements or were wounded by secondary effects. German troops commonly reported that 50 caliber fire through masonry created stone shrapnel as dangerous as the bullets themselves. Whether this is medically precise or perceptual amplification, it reveals the weapon's psychological footprint. The strategic impact wasn't immediate. Wars don't turn on single weapons. They turn on accumulated effects. But by mid-1944, those effects were undeniable. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority, not because German fighters were inferior. The FW-190 and Bf-109G were excellent aircraft, but they couldn't sustain operations in the face of concentrated 50 caliber fire from both bombers and escorts. Loss rates among German fighters climbed throughout 1944. Pilot training hours declined as fuel and aircraft became scarce. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe transitioned from an offensive force to a defensive force to a token force. The M2 Browning was one of many factors driving that decline, but it was a measurable factor. Post-war analysis suggests that .50 caliber guns accounted for a significant share of German fighter losses during daylight raids. The exact figures remain debated, but the trend is clear. On the ground, the effect was subtler but equally important. German infantry and armor learned to avoid engagement with American convoys when possible. Ambush tactics shifted from direct assault to standoff mining and long-range anti-tank fire. Panzerfaust teams rarely got close range against American mechanized columns. The 50 caliber fire suppressed them before they could position. The result was a tactical pace advantage. American forces could move faster, with less risk, sustain higher operational tempos. Time is a strategic resource. The side that can move faster can concentrate force more effectively, exploit breakthroughs more completely, disrupt enemy planning more thoroughly. The M2 didn't win battles alone, but it accelerated the pace at which battles were won. German tactical revisions throughout 1944 and 1945 reflect this adaptation. Fighter pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements with bomber formations, to focus on isolated stragglers. Infantry units were advised to engage American convoys only from prepared positions with anti-tank support. Panzerfaust teams received guidance to remain concealed until the last possible moment, to fire from maximum effective range, then immediately withdraw. All of these revisions reduced German effectiveness. The initiative belonged to the side that could force the enemy to adapt. The M2, networked and abundant, forced adaptation. One German officer reportedly observed that Americans don't fight with weapons, they fight with factories. The sentiment captures a truth whether the quote is documented or not. The M2 Browning was effective not because it was the finest heavy machine gun ever designed, but there were so many of them. They worked so reliably. The ammunition supply never faltered. In engineering terms, the system was over-designed for its task. In military terms, that over-design created margin for error. Guns could jam occasionally and it didn't matter. There were 3 more covering the same sector. Ammunition could be expended prodigiously and it didn't matter. More would arrive tomorrow. This was the luxury of industrial superiority translated into tactical flexibility. The economic dimension deserves attention. Manufacturing hundreds of thousands of M2HB machine guns and millions of 50 caliber weapons total required enormous resources. Steel, machining time, skilled labor, quality control. But the United States had those resources and the infrastructure to deploy them. Germany, facing strategic bombing, resource shortages, and labor constraints, couldn't match American production volumes in any category by 1944. The M2 was a symptom of that disparity. Its ubiquity on the battlefield was a daily reminder to German troops that they were fighting a wealthier enemy, wealthier in materials, in logistics, in the ability to sustain operations indefinitely. That knowledge erodes morale in ways that battlefield defeats do not. A defeat can be avenged. An industrial gap cannot be overcome. The M2 Browning is still in service, not as a museum piece or ceremonial weapon, but as a front-line system. More than 90 years after its introduction, the M2 remains the standard heavy machine gun for US forces and dozens of allied militaries worldwide. This longevity is almost unprecedented in military hardware. Small arms typically have service lives of 20 to 30 years before obsolescence. The M2 has outlived its designers, the country that opposed it, multiple generations of replacement attempts. The technical reasons for this longevity are straightforward. The .50 BMG cartridge remains effective against modern threats: light armor, vehicles, helicopters, personnel in cover, materiel targets. The ballistics haven't changed because the physics haven't changed. A half-inch projectile moving at roughly 2,900 feet per second delivers sufficient energy to defeat most non-hardened targets. The weapon's mechanical simplicity means it can be maintained with minimal tools and training. The parts count is low. The tolerances are forgiving. A competent armorer can disassemble, inspect, and reassemble an M2 in under an hour. There's nothing exotic about it, which makes it robust. But the doctrinal reasons are more interesting. The US military has built 90 years of institutional knowledge around the M2. Every vehicle mounting system, every firing technique, every maintenance procedure has been refined through combat experience across multiple wars and environments. There is no learning curve. Recruits train on the same weapon their great-grandfathers used in World War II. Ammunition is standardized and stockpiled in quantities measured in hundreds of millions of rounds. Replacement parts are available everywhere. This institutional continuity creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The weapon stays in service because the military knows how to use it effectively. The military knows how to use it effectively because it's been in service for so long. Modern upgrades have addressed the weapon's few weak points. The M2A1 variant introduced a fixed headspace and timing system, eliminating the manual adjustment that required skill and time. Quick change barrel kits further reduced maintenance time. Remote weapon stations allow the M2 to be operated from inside armored vehicles, protecting the gunner while retaining the weapon's effectiveness. Improved optics and mounting systems extend its practical range. But the core weapon remains fundamentally unchanged from John Browning's 1930s design. The receiver, the barrel, the operating mechanism. Lelauer's international adoption tells its own story. The M2 has been licensed, copied, and manufactured by countries across every continent. Some versions are direct copies, some are improved variants, but all share the same basic architecture and fire the same ammunition. This global standardization creates interoperability benefits. Allied forces can share ammunition, parts, maintenance expertise. Captured weapons can be employed immediately. Training transfers seamlessly across national boundaries. The M2 became the global standard for heavy machine guns not through treaty or agreement, through demonstrated effectiveness and logistical convenience. The .50 BMG cartridge itself deserves credit. Introduced in the early 1920s and standardized shortly after, the cartridge remains in widespread military and civilian use more than a century later. This is extraordinary. Most military cartridges are obsolete within 50 years, as newer designs offer better ballistics, reduced weight, or improved manufacturing efficiency. The 50 BMG persists because it occupies a performance niche that newer designs haven't significantly improved upon. For targets requiring more energy than a rifle cartridge but less than a cannon round, the 50 BMG remains the optimized solution. That optimization has proven remarkably durable. We began with a pilot staring into a wall of traces and doubt. Staff Sergeant Michael Rostovich behind his 50 caliber Browning, August 17th, 1943. The bomber streamed deep into German airspace. Fighter attacks continuous for 30 minutes. Rostovich has fired perhaps 1,000 rounds. The barrel is hot but not critical. The gun hasn't jammed. Around him, the other guns are firing in staggered bursts, creating a rhythm he can feel through the aircraft's frame. Outside, German fighters are executing attack runs with increasing desperation. The probability model said this should be working. The mathematics of closure rates, deflection angles, and defensive fire density all pointed toward German success. But the math was wrong. The sound of the M2 at full cyclic rate is distinctive, not a buzz or a whine, but a deep, percussive hammering. Each shot is audible as a discrete event until the rate climbs above 400 rounds per minute. Then the individual shots blur into a continuous roar. Inside a B-17 at altitude, with 10 or 12 guns firing simultaneously, the sound is overwhelming. Pilots reported that they couldn't hear engine noise during heavy defensive fire, couldn't hear radio communications, couldn't hear anything except the guns. The aluminum fuselage amplified and channeled the sound, turning the entire aircraft into a resonating chamber. German pilots attacking from the front reported that they could hear the defensive fire over their own engine noise, a deep, sustained rumble that preceded the visible traces by a fraction of a second. The visual signature was equally distinctive. Traces from a 50 caliber gun burn bright red-orange and remain visible for over a mile. At night, they're visible for 2 miles or more. A combat box of 20 bombers, each firing multiple guns, created a web of light visible from the ground. Allied ground forces in Italy and France reported that they could identify bomber formations at night by the defensive fire alone. Streams of traces converging on attacking fighters, creating geometric patterns against the darkness. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Flying into that visual wall required not just skill, but a willingness to accept probabilistic death. Some pilots accepted it, many did not. Those who hesitated, who broke off attacks early, who chose evasion over closure, survived longer but contributed less to German defensive efforts. The 50 caliber created a selection pressure that removed aggression from the German fighter force. The mathematics that failed weren't wrong in principle. They were wrong in assumption. German planners assumed isolated bomber engagements, reasonable weapon reliability, defensive fire patterns comparable to their own doctrine. They encountered networked defensive systems, exceptional weapon reliability, firepower density, an order of magnitude beyond their planning parameters. The error wasn't in calculation, it was in imagination. They couldn't imagine that an enemy would deploy a heavy machine gun so ubiquitously, maintain it so reliably, supply it so abundantly that it became the default solution to almost every tactical problem. This wasn't how European military doctrine thought about weapons. Weapons were specialized, carefully employed, conserved. The M2 was industrial, common, expendable, prodigious. That philosophical gap proved unbridgeable. By war's end, the M2 had become the reference standard. German reports no longer described it as an anomaly. They described it as the baseline against which other weapons were measured. Soviet doctrine, observing American success, began incorporating similar principles of firepower density and reliability over sophistication. Post-war military planners globally recognized that the lesson of the M2 wasn't about heavy machine guns specifically. It was about systems, reliable weapons, sufficient logistics, networked deployment, doctrine that matched capabilities to resources. The M2 won not because it was superior, but because it was sufficient. And sufficiency deployed at scale defeats superiority deployed scarcely. The sound fades. The mission over Schweinfurt ends as missions do. Some aircraft return, some do not. Staff Sergeant Rostovich survives this mission and many more. His gun never jams. The ammunition never runs out. The Germans never solve the problem of the 50 caliber defensive grid. They adapt, they revise, they innovate. But adaptation is a concession. The initiative has shifted. In the end, the arithmetic of firepower, scale, reliability, and geometry changed the odds.